Welcome to Shattered Reality with your hosts Kate Valentine and Fahrusha. Prepare to have your paradigms shifted and your truths questioned. And now, Shattered Reality.
Hey, Kate.
Hey, Fahrusha. Here we are, back again.
After a long sabbatical, the entire month of August, we were off, and I was lucky enough to go down to the Monroe Institute, where I looked at some of my past lives. In any case, let us slate here. Today is September 13th, 2016, and this is podcast number 36.
Okay.
And we really have a very, very interesting and unusual lady here with us today.
And lucky to have her with us.
Yes, and she's very kind and generous and forthcoming. It's Lisette Larkins. She is a prolific author and experiencer. Her latest book is Above and Beyond: The Incredible True Story of Extraterrestrial Contact. So Lisette is a long-term experiencer of the paranormal and of contact with beings not currently incarnated as humans who have identified to her as aliens. So Lisette, we're so happy to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. I read through some of your books and through some of your videos, and they were fascinating. You are a little bit outside the, how would you say? Well, I mean, you can't really. Yeah. It's not the average like experience or abductee type story. So it was really sort of interesting for us because we hear a lot of the sort of, well, it's
Abduction accounts.
Yeah, well, you can't really call them humdrum.
No.
But they certainly were different from yours, and it was sort of fascinating. It's hard enough to come forth with stories about abduction, but to come forth with stories of this nature that are atypical is even more difficult. So you're quite courageous.
Yeah. And I just to make one comment here is that we generally have three categories of people who have had this type of experience. They can be called abductees, they can be called experiencers, or they can be called, oh my gosh, I just...
What? It slipped?
It also a senior moment.
Oh, okay, but
the third kind are the people from back in the 50s and early 60s.
Oh, contactees.
The contactees, that's right. And I just choose to use the word experiencer myself, having had some of those experiences.
It covers everything, too.
It encompasses the other two categories as well. What do you prefer, Lisette?
Well, in my books, I, too, use the word experiencer.
Good.
And it's funny because really that's what we're all doing, even in this realm. We're just like, experiencing all kinds of stuff on the kind of the big roller coaster of life. We're on the upswing or the downswing, but it's woo, the ride is wild.
Yes, it is. And I was very interested in your book that you had mentioned, kind of looking to Eckhart Tolle a little bit because I am also a fan of his and saw him over the summer. But before we get too far afield, perhaps you could lay out basically parts of your story that you think are very pertinent and necessary for our listeners to understand, and also because at the end of our interview with you, we are going to be conducting a contest with our listeners for a set of your books. So let us know, just give us a little backdrop on what happened with you here.
Well, my first kind of strange experience happened when I was about 7. And I was just, and I really don't remember too much about it other than I had some kind of interesting encounter as a child with some kind of different dimension or interdimensional being. And then I kind of put it out of my memory and forgot all about it for almost, for decades, really. And then it wasn't until 20-something years later, when I was a young mother with a young infant, and I was married at the time, and I was really feeling a lot of stress. I had difficulty with my marriage. My husband and I were struggling with lots of different issues with respect to our relatively new marriage and having a young child now in the house, and all the stressors of that. And I really started to seek something else. I was seeking answers internally. I hadn't yet started to read about these kinds of experiences. My search at the time was just prayerful. I just was aware enough to know that I needed some kind of help, because I knew that if the relationship continued like we were, we probably would be separating, and I really didn't want that for my son. Now, as it turned out, we did end up separating, actually. But the point was that I was at a place where I was prayerful. I was searching internally. And so in one of these nights during which my husband was out of town traveling, I had again kind of gone to bed. My son was now asleep, and I was in one of those prayerful modes. I had just closed the book that I was reading, and I was contemplating, what was the answer to my dilemma. And in that kind of a prayerful state, looking, searching, this kind of cone of white light burst through the ceiling, envelops me completely, and it was accompanied by all kinds of phenomena. That means, all my senses were blasted with kind of this visceral, life-shaking moment, including an electromagnetic kind of feeling like I was being electrocuted, electromagnetic speaking. Also, there was a cone of bright light, so I felt blinded by this intensity of light. And I could hear this loud, almost the sound of a locomotive going through my bedroom. It was almost deafening. And I didn't know what was happening. I had no idea what was happening. And that started me on this long journey, beginning to recognize, but it took years to recognize what it was, but beginning to unravel this whole adventure of what would happen if a human being could actually tap into interdimensional experiences. And these beings, they don't, live on planet Earth like we do. They exist in some other dimension in a way that I don't understand or comprehend from a scientific standpoint. But I started having these encounters. So for a couple of years, I really didn't know. I had no visual. I didn't really know what was happening, other than I was spontaneously starting to have kind of new abilities. I started to become psychic in some way. I started to have second sight. I started to be able to see snippets of future events. And so, but these were upsetting to me at the time. They didn't encourage me. I was upset because things were happening, things were going bump in the night, so to speak. And yet, as the encounters would begin, like they did that first night, with a barrage of phenomena, I would start to fall asleep. So it was years before I stopped falling asleep, and I remained awake, and then I saw really what was happening.
Well, it's the thing that drew me to your work. Some years ago, when I was looking for answers, and I found also Bob Monroe's work, the situation of having the electrical current running through your body and being paralyzed, which is something that has happened to me numerous times. Sometimes it seems like there's ET contact. Sometimes there seems as though there are other sorts of contact. But I certainly shared that terrifying experience of being paralyzed and having the electrical current running through my body, particularly coming in through the upper lip, the nose, and the third eye area, so much so, and so painful and so frightening. So I was very much attracted to your work because you described something which was not the same, because I didn't have the light show, but quite similar to what I had experienced, and also similar to what Bob Monroe had experienced, which drew me initially down to Virginia to the Monroe Institute. And it was there that someone acquainted me with your books.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. Well, yes, I actually have taught classes there before, and I love both the property, the actual location, and the people there. What a wonderful opportunity that you experienced that. I love that myself, that place.
So after that, after you began to have these experiences, then other events unfolded, including your experience worrying or being concerned or having certain events occur that made you worried about your sanity.
Yes.
Well, may I just
Sure.
interject really quickly? Because I am sure some of the listeners or some of the not some of the skeptics, let me say, are going to ask. It sounds as if this type of reaction could be due to a medical condition of some sort as well. And I think you looked into all that, didn't you, from what I understand in your books?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so as my relationship worsened with my then husband, we agreed that I should get some help because although I wasn't telling him everything that was happening, I was telling him enough that he was alarmed. So perhaps in part because he was an ex-military officer, in the way that he thought, it's black or white. If it doesn't look like something that we know, then it's probably something crazy. And so we decided that, and he encouraged me to, and took me to a psychiatric hospital where I was admitted. And they started doing extensive testing. Now, at that time, I still didn't really know what was happening to me. And I was the model patient, although at that point, there was no medication that was prescribed. But I was there for 3 weeks, and it was very traumatizing because it was there that, and then I lost custody of my child.
Oh, yeah.
When I got out 3 weeks later, that's when I really decided I had to rebuild my life. Because when I got out 3 weeks later, I had lost custody. I was now, my then husband had filed for divorce. Checking accounts closed. I really had hit a bottom. So I started in earnest to find answers. And one of the things that I was seeking was being willing and wanting the courage to be able to face if I did have an underlying mental disorder. Because I wanted to get custody of my child, but I really didn't want him raised by me if I was crazy. So I felt it was something that I had to do. So I was lucky. I really searched until I found a wonderful therapist, and I started on a 6-year intensive process of being both analyzed by an individual and a team of clinicians, including individual therapy and group therapy, and I submitted myself to an extensive evaluative process. And interestingly enough, my lead clinician actually became a contributor to my first book, Talking to Extraterrestrials. There's an appendix in the back of the book, which addresses this thing that happens where otherwise normal people, of course there are people who legitimately have a psychiatric condition who have visions and they hear voices. Of course we know that happens. But what also can happen is that otherwise normal people can open to these amazing, extraordinary, paranormal, or otherworldly experiences that can tap into an interdimensional experience, and there is no underlying psychosis. And so this is what I was told. I was eventually told, and this clinician shares in this forward by himself. He has a practice in Westlake, California. He still does, that I was of sound mind. So at that point, after all of these years, as I became more confident in which I was being told, you have a sound mind. Well, if I'm not crazy, then what's happening? You see, so then I really, in earnest, started to become more willing and courageous to go further, because there was a 2-year period then, after which the experiences stopped.
That's interesting.
And it was during this period in which I was really kind of almost apprehensively looking to find what was happening to me. And so at a certain point when I had done a lot of kind of personal growth work on myself, meaning my self-concept had improved because I was just stronger. I was more mature. I had had some therapy. I was feeling better about my divorce, and I was now working again, and I was building back my life with my child. I had regained custody. Then I was just all that more willing and able to then to know. Mm-hmm. And as that happened, by gosh, the experiences started up all over again. But this time, instead of falling asleep and not being able to remember what was happening, I remained awake. And that was when the really good stuff started happening, because now I was going forward with confidence. I was going forward with an ability to want to kind of make a record of what I was learning. And that, of course, makes up the content of my books, which is what did I learn? What was I told? How did it affect me? Why did the experiences happen? And for me, the experiences happened because, first of all, life is filled with these kinds of life-changing events, whether paranormal in nature or very much of this world. But we oftentimes are impacted by these life-changing, initially traumatizing events, and it is our duty to find a way to overcome them with strength and courage in order to move beyond them and to grow from them. And that was what I set out to do.
That's a wonderfully inspiring way to look at these things, certainly.
Yeah, because they're frightening.
Oh, absolutely.
They're frightening. And John Mack did a study of so many people that had similar experiences and problems to yours, and the consistent finding was these are totally normal people that are experiencing totally abnormal events.
That's right.
And, I think one of the problems is that they happen sort of spontaneously and sporadically, and they can't be duplicated. And, if you see something frightening in the ocean, like the great white shark, well, that can be documented. Everybody else sees it. Everybody else knows. If you see something like an extraterrestrial in the backwoods of New Hampshire on a dark night and you're all alone, that can't be documented. That is frightening. People tend to, because they're frightened, say, oh, no, it never happened. It's okay. That's just a little ghost. Forget about it. And I think that's the problem with the people that have experienced these things have. It's horrible because everybody else looks at you as if you're really a little bit wacko.
Not everybody anymore. I think but we live in a rarefied atmosphere, you and I, Kate, because we're involved in this community, so to speak. I would like to speak to one thing that it's kind of my pet subject, and you're just the right person to speak to about it, because I myself have written a number of blog posts about it, and this has to do with the concept of sleep paralysis, which is in fact a normal biological adaptation that higher mammals at least have made to the dream process, because many people get sleep paralyzed. Cats and dogs and horses do it too, and it's in order to avoid acting out our dreams. However, my thesis is this, and I would like to do a study about it at some juncture. My thesis is that other beings, other interdimensional or alien beings, use the process of sleep paralysis in order to have the human mind open to them, because we are actually quite violent individuals. And if something comes down the road towards us that we don't like, I'm not talking about you and I, Lisette or Kate there. I'm talking about the average person. If you see something that you're not familiar with and it comes over to you, you're likely to strike out. We're not called angry apes with guns for nothing. So the natural biological process of sleep paralysis is co-opted by the let's just call them aliens for shorthand, the aliens, to subdue the human in order that they might be communicated with. What do you think about that?
I am no expert on sleep paralysis, and I'm obviously not a physician or a clinician. But from my perspective, and after thinking and contemplating and having these experiences for so many years, because I agree with you that because we're having these experiences, they're interdimensional experiences. And so when we start, because as humans, we are a spiritual mind that's melded with a human brain. And so when we're living and we're attached to the human body in this particular incarnation, and somehow, some way, we have found a portal to an interdimensional experience, which can be happening in a physical environment like planet Earth. Doesn't mean that it's not really happening. It doesn't mean that it's only a figment of our imagination or that's only a dream. We can be having a very real experience, but it's happening in an interdimensional way in which we've somehow tapped into interdimensional phenomena, other beings who are living interdimensionally in the present, and or tapping into the memories of ourselves having lived in a different incarnation, but we're experiencing that interdimensional experience. Or thirdly, that we're doing it currently, meaning I'm living in life as a human being, but I'm concurrently living a life as a different being with this other group of people or this other group of beings in this different location, and the two have kind of melded together in this moment of confusion. So I'm having a glimpse into another interdimensional experience, which is happening concurrently. So there's so many different possibilities, and yet naturally, when all of this is going down, it wouldn't seem too out of the ordinary if we're dealing with other beings who have a heightened sense of evolution, spiritually speaking, that there's this recognition that let's kind of contain the physical body as one is experiencing these phenomena. Now, I do recognize that the people who are more attuned to the so-called UFO abduction phenomena, in which they feel that they've been violated and they feel that they've been kidnapped and they feel that they've been paralyzed. I'm speaking from the perspective of, in my particular opinion, we're all open as beings and to having extraordinary experiences across all the domains. So even human beings are having experiences on planet Earth in which they're harmed, meaning whether they're kidnapped or they go to Syria and their car is bombed, or somebody breaks into their house and steals their television set. Because we have a mixed bag of spiritual growth, both on this planet, it also reflects what's happening universally speaking. We have all of these beings in lots of different locations, both in this dimension and others, in which there are various and varying degrees of spiritual attainment. And so when that happens, it doesn't mean that only one of those things is happening. It means that all of it can be happening.
Yes.
The only issue is when somebody experiences trauma or terror, it doesn't always necessarily assume that wrongdoing is occurring. And that's, of course, what I found out, because I was traumatized.
Yes.
I was terrified. And I know that when I even take my dog to the vet, she is terrified. And interestingly enough, she's lost one eye just from a hiking accident.
Oh, dear.
And she's had 2 leg surgeries. When I go to show up at that vet, when she sees those vets with their lab coats, or even the technicians with their scrubs, she bolts. She doesn't like them. And so she attributes wrongdoing and harm to people who, their intent is to help her.
Yes.
So, the human brain can't make sense of everything.
That's absolutely true. And I am happy to say, as having been an experiencer, I'm here none the worse for wear. And the experiences were very interesting and in some cases enlightening. But at the time they are happening, especially with the vibrations, as you know, can be, the loss of control alone, forget even the vibration, is a really big pill to swallow.
Yes, and when something is happening that is not supposed to happen, when it's happening in a context of a society that doesn't believe that it's possible. Now, I still, even today, I can go to social, I can be in a social environment, whether at a party or a dinner party, and this subject can come up, and you better believe, even in Los Angeles, there are absolutely still even clinicians who are very aligned with, say, the psychiatric field, who say absolutely categorically that this is not possible. It's only some degree of insanity that's being expressed, and that it's not possible that interdimensional beings, from a scientific standpoint, can interact with human beings. So, it's very much still refuted in many, many circles.
One can only hope that they get an experience one night.
Yes, and that will set them in a different category entirely. But I am also reminded of what the quantum physicists have said, that consciousness is fundamental to everything. It comes first and foremost before the world of matter.
Yeah. But the hardline physicists don't believe that.
But the materialists don't go for it.
Yeah, no. And you will not find an engineer that does that either.
I know an engineer who does.
Oh, okay. But, honestly, I have to agree with you. And so you had these experiences, and you said that they were helpful in your life. Do you think that they were helpful because they were intended to be helpful, or that it was just a side effect of them?
Interestingly enough, ultimately, the purpose of my encounter experiences were the same as the purpose of the process of the physical body, human body dying, and then transitioning to an interlife experience, and then coming back. So, and what am I saying there? What I'm saying is that my extraterrestrial contact experiences ultimately provided a context for me to rest and reflect on my actions and my motivations with respect to the life that I am living right now. And yet, what I found is during these ET encounters, I somehow had this ability to be transitioned to this very interlife where we go when we die, and to be able to again see these experiences of me both in the past, meaning as a soul reviewing other lives, and also to be benefited by information that was given to me by my wise counsel as to the goals of my soul in this particular life. So talk about mind-blowing. All of a sudden now I'm experiencing what others who have written about near-death experiences are right now, and now I'm experiencing that. So it's like, wait a minute, what do aliens have to do with near-death experiences? And from what I know today is that somehow I was able to enter this portal and have these interdimensional experiences. But that experience did not stop with being able to perceive and conceive of these otherworldly beings and the information that they gave me and the communications that I had. In fact, it went further than that. I was able to access recurring experiences in which I was in the interlife, in which I was re-experiencing the interlife. And so what I gained from that was this really wonderful perspective on what we're doing here as human beings in any given incarnation, and how our goals vary from soul to soul, which is why some of us have interdimensional experiences and others don't. But also, what was the overarching message and power of having that information? So it's just astounding to me. It still is astounding to me to be able to have been provided a vehicle in which it all started to make sense to me. Meaning, it all started to make sense why we have such opportunities for joy, and yet there's experiences of great sorrow.
And suffering, yes.
And while we're talking right now, I'm looking at the Pacific Ocean, and
wow.
It's so magnificently beautiful. And where I am sitting is this vast view of the ocean, and yet last night I was watching the children in the ceasefire in Aleppo, and how heartbreaking it is, and how did they get to be there in all that sorrow, and I got to be here, and what are the mechanisms that made all that happen?
Yes.
Why did those souls choose that, and if indeed we have choice? And so this is what became my interests. These were my interests in the later part of my life, which is right now, which is having benefited from all these extraordinary encounter experiences, and yet now I'm really, really interested, not in counting and qualifying and quantifying how many toes the aliens have, or
right.
But what is behind the veil of the universe itself?
What's the point of it all? Yes.
That's my interest.
Wow, that's sort of that's a question.
That's
that
a
if
big question.
you come up with the answer to that one, your books will be going off the shelf. But you speak of this interlife. Is that sort of? Is there something? When you say inter, I imagine this life, obviously, that we're experiencing. Then there's the inter, and what's beyond that? Is there another plane of existence so that the inter is in between them, or?
Meaning the afterlife.
Just the after. Okay.
Yeah. The only reason I'd call it the interlife is to qualify that there's going to be another life. There's going to be more life.
I see. So it's in between lives. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, the afterlife. Where we're going, we die. Where the soul's not dying. The soul hasn't died. And so, here we go. So it is very strange, even to me today, that here I am having had extraterrestrial contact experiences, but now I'm teaching and talking about what happens in the afterlife. And how that all came together is surprising and extraordinary, but I wouldn't have it any other way, because to know what's happening in the afterlife, it makes us able to know what's happening to us right now.
But I think you were almost not supposed to know, right? I mean, because if you did know, like, oh, well, I'm just here for 85, 90 years, and this will happen, and I'll learn my lesson, and I'll go back. And so it's all just a lesson learning thing. If you don't know that there's an afterlife, this becomes a lot more real, and the suffering and the happiness becomes a lot more real. So I think we're actually not supposed to know. That's just my opinion, obviously. I mean, it's not based on anything other than that.
I agree, because from what I understand is that the individuals who need to know for the sake of their own growth and where they are at the moment.
Okay.
They will be drawn to the material because there's something very important that they're wanting to know, and it will help them move to the next level of their growth. Conversely, people who deny those experiences, deny that there's an afterlife, deny that there's anything else, are at a place of their own growth where they're definitely not supposed to know. That may change, but it helps also have more patience and compassion for people who are absolutely closed-minded. Because they're working on other things. And really, it's kind of like we don't expose our kindergartners to sophisticated concepts of anatomy, sexuality, and mathematics, because they're just working on, they're in the early stages of their program.
Right.
They're in the early stages of their development. They may be, it may be their first 10 or 15 incarnations, let alone their first 5, right? So their guides would necessarily keep them focused on just what they're doing. And so they may be completely closed to that, and their guides want it that way. So, for example, if somebody who's in their early stages of their development, or even in the late stages of their development, and that's another, I'll talk about that in a second, let's just say they go to hypnotherapy and they want to be regressed so that they can access all their other lives and what's happening in the afterlife. And let's just say they do that and they just get nothing. There's no information because, for whatever reason, their mind is closed to that from experience. It doesn't mean that that there are none. It doesn't mean that there have been no other lives. It doesn't mean that there is no, spiritual guidance or that there's no afterlife. It just means that they, for their own particular reasons, they're being tested on certain abilities right now, and it is important that they not that they're not aware that there's a council of wise elders, looking over their shoulder, evaluating what they're going to do next. So it's like this amnesia. You're right. In my opinion, we do agree to forget. Mm-hmm. We do, but then some of us have these other experiences, and then we talk about them, and then those people who are working on a certain area in their life in which they are wanting certain memories jogged for the sake of their own growth, they will be drawn to those radio interviews or those books that start to open them up because of what they're working on. So it's kind of interesting. There is this crazy perfection of timing as far as opening to other realities. There's a right time for it, and then there's also a time where it's not necessary for our growth, such as, the example of a kindergartner or first grader. We're not going to bombard them with certain subjects until they're ready for that.
Right. They're still learning to share their candies.
Yeah, they are. But, on these aliens that you have discovered or that have communicated with you, now, are they forever in the afterlife? Are they sort of like guides, or do they get reincarnated into wherever?
My understanding is that all beings go through incarnational experiences because, yes, it just from my understanding, it depends. I'm talking about in physical existences, and then universally, once we reach a certain level of attainment, then we stop needing to incarnate into a physical body.
Okay.
And that goes along with certain places like planet Earth. The human body lives, anywhere depending up until about 100, given certain factors. Mm-hmm. And that I'm aware that there are other existences, physical existences, where beings can live longer than that or much shorter than that. Some beings may incarnate in their early existences on planets in which they have different abilities. They might be flying beings, but with a conscious mind, and they're an intelligent species, and yet that cycle of life might be only, a year. Mm-hmm. So it depends what that soul is working on and where it is incarnating.
Yes, look at damselflies, all right? They live just overnight. Mm-hmm. So it's totally within the scope of even the biology that we know here on Earth.
What about animals? Just curious.
Yes.
What is the feelings on that? I'll tell you, I think my dog is nicer than a lot of people. So, but is that considered a soul, or is there a certain level of intelligence that's required?
My understanding is that yes, that all living beings have souls. Uh-huh. They may be different aspect of the way that we know the soul, the kind of the transition of souls moving towards attainment. Okay. It may be slightly different, but all beings have some kind of soul, and where they go after death may not be with us as humans, but it doesn't mean that we're not able to experience them again. So, from my understanding, even after death, we're able to still have encounters with those animals, the souls of those animals that we've loved.
I see. I just want to discuss briefly with you one of the experiences towards the end of Above and Beyond, which was it was an experience where you were taken aboard a craft, and you saw something that was more typical of the abductees' experience. In other words, there were hybrids there, and there were animals that were frozen in the inside of the vehicle. Do you want to speak to that a minute? Because I thought that was very interesting, and it kind of explained some of the hybrid, some of the abductees' experience with the thoughts about hybrids and so forth. And I thought that part was very, very interesting and might be of great interest to our listeners, many of whom are drawn to the UFO subculture, so to
But
speak.
but even before
Yes.
Lisette, before you answer, we should tell our listening audience that this is Lisette Larkins.
Yes, good.
And the author of a book, Above and Beyond, talking to extraterrestrials and difficult people. Boy,
And two others, listening to extraterrestrials, and
yeah.
what was the fifth one?
Talking. Oh, that Lisette, we're going to have to ask you.
Yes, I
I'm sorry, we'll have to. But really, this is Lisette Larkins, and certainly, I'm sure you're on the internet
and go out and get those books because they are really eye-opening.
Yeah, and in this short period of time, you cannot really download the entire lifetime of experiences.
Of course not.
That's why God invented books.
Yes.
Right. You know, at this point in my life, and because of all of the kind of various and strange experiences that I've had, you know, I don't think you can kind of load one experience and then call that one good and the other one evil. Mm-hmm. So I know what you're talking about, though. You're asking about, you know, typical to the UFO abduction model, there are cattle mutilations, for instance. And so what does that mean for someone like me who is saying, I don't feel that I was kidnapped or abducted. I don't feel these were evil aliens. And yet I saw what you might consider to be livestock, typical to the others' reports of cattle mutilations. Well, in my case, first of all, you know, there are lots of places to incarnate, other planets that have animals that look very much like the animals that we know here. So it doesn't mean that just because we see a cow that we're on, and we're having some perceptions of an interdimensional experience, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're on planet Earth and aliens have come here and somehow harmed a cow here.
No.
If there is a bleed through, and there can be with people who are experiencing interdimensional experiences, if there is and can be a bleed through in which we're either experiencing past lives of ourselves living in different dimensions, in other physical locations, or concurrent experiences, we can obviously experience and witness and see all kinds of creatures, big and small, human-like, humanoid-like, and animal-like. And in my case, I witnessed these animals that look like the cows that we have here and the sheep that we have here. But there were some startling differences. And those differences were that their coat, or the sheep's, what do you call it, their hair?
Well,
it was
the fleece.
Extraordinarily beautiful. I mean, it was long and luxurious, and I was struck by this. So I can't say exactly where I was and what kind of experience I was having, but I did notice that they couldn't move. But whether they were dead or alive, I felt that they were surrounded by this pulsating light. So it's possible that they were not even dead. They were just there, and I was amazed that, you know, that they were there, because I was clearly having this interdimensional experience, and I was seeing these, you know, 4 foot tall, this little gray alien head, as we described them, this inversed pear-shaped head with the large black wraparound eyes. And yet, so there were cows, there were aliens, and yet, you know, what if something else is happening other than somebody's suggesting that the aliens have scooped up the cows and they're mutilating them and they're, you know, harvesting their body parts for some reason? So I didn't see that. I only saw other animals that I recognize on planet Earth in the vicinity of these alien beings. And from all that I have seen and all that I know, now I'm more kind of viscerally aware of how many extraordinarily large number of potential types of incarnational experiences that are open to the soul.
That's lovely. That's a very, very nice a way of putting it. I also recall that you had mentioned that the others, the visitors, if you will, had expressed to you that all reproduction did not have to be through, if you'll forgive the term, carnal knowledge, and that that there were sort of hybrid children that they kept there. I don't know where there is. We've gone through that, so there's no need to, speak to what there is there. But that you encountered hybrid children, and also that they had mentioned to you that they were keeping these children in case it was necessary to restock a planet with humans, because humans may be doing something negative to the planet. So there we come close to the I'm forgetting what they're called, the 50s people.
Contactees?
The contactees. The message that the contactees were always getting was that humans were destroying the earth and needed to be much more careful, which I'd have to agree with that general concept. But perhaps your friends there said that things were not going to be ending shortly on Earth. So maybe you could speak to those two ideas a little bit.
I love it when we try to clarify and classify a phenomena that is incomprehensible on Earth. I mean, these ideas are incomprehensible in many ways, and they were even as I was experiencing them. And so there's no shortage of experiential possibilities.
Yes.
And having had these near-death experiences without having died, having had these afterlife or interlife experiences without having lost my current body, and having been introduced to, in full consciousness, my kind of council of elders and my guides, the soul, it's just the opportunities for growth they're just abundant. So usually, from what I understand, is when a soul is slated for developing on Earth, they continue to come to Earth. But there are many souls, particularly experiencers, who didn't start on Earth. They started someplace else. And in those dimensional experiences, there have been other observations. There have been other beings other experiences in which different kinds of beings are creating different kinds of offspring. And then when we retain those memories, it also speaks to having experiences in which we're witnessing something in an interdimensional experience, and yet we can't quite grasp how we're experiencing it, how we're witnessing it. And so, it's through the human mind speaking right now that we're attempting to classify and clarify these things. And yet, there's this kind of there's an extraordinary perfection to the process of spiritual attainment of souls. And what I learned was that process happens, for better or for worse, through the unfolding of experiencing wrongdoing.
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 Ah.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that there's, quote, bad karma. It means that it is through all of different kinds of wrongdoing in all of its manifestations. And sometimes you can quote that. In other words, is there wrongdoing if a child is born into a body that has no legs and arms? And we know of human beings that has happened. We see them on the covers of books. And I've heard of one particular gentleman, and he's like a best-selling author. And it's absolutely phenomenal what he's accomplished and what he speaks about. But when we see or hear experiences like that, we say, gee, how does this person survive that? So the ways that we experience wrongdoing always necessarily, eventually shape the soul.
Yeah.
Now, how long that takes and the method that soul goes through in order to overcome all kinds of difficulties.
So if we just had a wonderful life with absolutely no downside at all, there's nothing to be learned from it.
Right.
However, it does sound sort of nice. I mean,
Well, I always say that when I back, I'd love to go to the giant pillow planet with lots of furry pink kittens.
Oh, that sounds nice.
But I know that's not going to help my growth experience too much, except I'll learn to bounce.
But that's an excellent point, though, and it does make clear a lot of things, as you said, like why should some soul choose to come back in a war-torn country as opposed to someone that would come to a country where there was lots of leisure and ability to learn and meditate and think about things. So, yeah, that makes perfect sense. It really does.
In our we have like sort of one segment left here available for us to talk to, and I would like to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about what one of the main lessons you apparently learned is certainly exposed quite well in your book, Difficult People, A Gateway to Enlightenment. So this was one of, I believe you would say, your major lessons from your experiences. So Difficult People, A Gateway to Enlightenment, one of your books, one of your later books. I don't know which comes last, Above and Beyond or Difficult People, but could you speak a little bit about the lessons you learned that brought you to Difficult People?
Yes, it was the place where I was in my growth, from what I now understand. Caring for a woman with Alzheimer's disease and caring for her through the end of her life was so challenging and so difficult that I had called the experience to myself, because at the time I was actually looking for a spiritual teacher, interestingly enough. I was ready to, move to India or live in an ashram or go to some place where, you had to kind of meditate and not talk for a month. And interestingly enough, my prayers were so, deeply felt, and I was so longing to really kind of develop myself. Next thing I knew, I had a job caring for a very difficult woman. And what I found was that was more potentially enlightening than any possible ashram I could have gone to. And kind of sequestered myself away from the worry and concerns of the world. And so in that experience, I became so aware of the goals of my soul. And I think that this is valuable for all of us as we kind of behold really challenging circumstances. If we can step back enough to see what the soul of ourselves is up to, what the goals of the soul are up to, what we're trying to learn, then we recognize that not only is it incumbent upon us to face our struggles with courage and dignity and kind of enthusiasm, but that to bail out of it, whether through suicide or using, drugs or alcohol or substances in order to numb ourselves, we really are selling ourselves short. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why certain souls do have the amnesia listed, and why we may be seeing more of that on the planet, where the amnesia is lifting a little bit more, globally to some degree, because when you're talking about a world population that is numbed out from either pharmaceutical drugs, alcohol, or any other substance, when you're talking about a greater and greater percentage of the world population that are numbed out, those individuals become stuck in their growth. And when it becomes so significant, the spiritual realm sees that. And it's important that as a species we move forward in our growth, because it's true, planet Earth is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult places to incarnate, because it's a planet of duality, meaning not the typical duality that we're speaking about in Eastern thought, but rather we have both physical challenges and we have mental challenges. And many planets, places of incarnation, only have one or the other. We have both.
Yes.
And we have both, simultaneously and concurrently and, unrelentingly. So, from birth until death, we have these opportunities in which we're experiencing physical challenges and emotional and mental challenges, and it is, challenging.
Yes.
Yeah, I'd say so. I'd say it's very challenging. and the duality, and that mirrors the duality between the materialists and the consciousness folks. It's a similar duality, yes. So, is there anything else you would like to tell us about the difficult people and what you've learned there before because we're just at about an hour now, but we want to give you full measure of your time because you've been so interesting and wonderful to come on our show.
Well, thank you. I think, I can only speak to what interests me and maybe interests others too, is that the difficult people point of view, meaning, yes, we have a difficult situation, we have difficult people, and, to a global extent, when we feel this great grief because we've got terrorists and we've got, a tremendous amount of homeless people who, how do we help the homeless and all the questions that we often ask, we can better understand the nature of life when we look at the nature of the soul. And from what I've seen and from what I've been taught and from what I know is that, there are stages of development for an incarnating soul, and it's all playing out right here on the planet. And so naturally, we are going to necessarily come up against the goals and activities characteristic of a young, immature soul, and the same with a little bit more advancing soul, or slightly more mature soul, and those of more advanced souls. And so how those different souls live their life is always characteristic of where they are in their own development. And when we know the characteristics of a beginning soul, an intermediate soul, an advanced soul, in my opinion, every problem becomes solvable. Because when we really identify those characteristics, then we know what we're dealing with, we know what we have, and we know how to deal with it. So, for example, a young soul, you can tell quite often, not all the time, but quite often, their characteristics are they tend to be more, striving for supremacy. There's more bickering. They hold the idea that love and trust only bring hurt. So their heart is closed. Their heart chakra is closed. They also, because of their relative immaturity spiritually, they regularly engage in self-deception. They can't be aware of self-motivations because they're not that mature yet. Just like a kindergartner is not that mature yet. They can't exhibit much self-awareness. And so when we look at the more maturing soul, they're starting to have a higher adaptability to change. They're more willing to start to help people. They're more able to find solutions to problems, unlike the young soul, not able to find solutions to problems. Change is hard for them. And then we also always recognize the more advancing soul, the Mother Teresa's, the beings who they're putting their practical spirituality to actual use. They're not isolating, they're not staying away from relationships and communicating and the messiness of life. They're right in there, they're right in there. And they're helping the people who are most affected by the movers and shakers of the world, rather than, for example, preferring to only help the movers and shakers of the world themselves. And so, their reference is more outward. They're able to interpret the struggles of their life and use it to benefit others. And so when we are able to see people who upset us and behold people who are upsetting us, and we can recognize the relative beginningness, the relative spiritual immaturity, it makes all the difference because it helps us to comprehend the cycles of life, the cycle that's happening on planet Earth, the relative suffering in relation to the joy. To me, that's where the power is because everything makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's great. I would say I can't imagine adding anything to that. I think it sums it up terrifically.
I do too. And once again, Lisette, thank you very much for being on our show today. And this podcast will live on the internet for quite a while.
And
so
on the interlife too, perhaps.
Have its own life. So we're going to say goodbye to you now with great appreciation and gratitude. And we're going to discuss the contest that we are about to embark upon with your books that you have so generously provided. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and perhaps the winner of the contest, it's funny how there's so much serendipity, will be encouraged by those books to also shed some light on other people's paths. It's funny, isn't it? Yeah.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Oh, it was wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks again. So that was Lisette Larkins, author of 5 books, and she is going to be gifting us with 3 sets of 3 books each for our lucky winners.
So listen up, all you undeveloped souls.
Yes. Well, what I'd like to do first is to make note of people that have made comments already, and then explain the contest.
I see. Okay.
Is that good, Kate?
That sounds great.
Okay.
Okay,
So,
here we go.
Shattered Reality Podcast
Do you want a drum roll?
wishes to express its thanks and gratitude to our listeners, all our listeners. But today we are giving a special thanks to some of our listeners who are brave and have made comments. They are Jerry and Roxanne, Susan Shaw, Bobby Torkova, Diane Danzo,
Yay.
Rob Freeman, David Coffin, Iconic Kevin, Peter Jeffries, Bob B., Susan Smiley, Jolly Mystic Mary, I like that one, Ed Thornton, Ellen S.J., Jim Spiker, Earl Voss, Matthew Thewell from the great old Great Britain, Jim Price, Nurse Nancy, Bill Vandenberg, Kevin Hester, Catherine Thompson, and Susie Brown. And in addition, we are also sending special greetings and thanks to Robert Friedman and Beth Hines of Rainbow Ridge Books, who are the publishers of these Lisette Larkins tomes. I don't know if tome is the exact right word. So,
How does one win this contest?
okay. So listen up and listen carefully. We are looking for commenters here on Shattered Reality Podcast. Now, there are various places where Shattered Reality Podcast can be downloaded, such as Stitcher Radio and YouTube and several other sites. But there are only 2 places where you can make comments and be in the contest. You can make comments on the other places, and we'll be very happy about that too. And we'll even answer. I always do. But the 2 places where you can make a comment about this particular show and this particular broadcast are at www.shatteredrealitypodcast.com, which is our main site, and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com, which is our sort of mirror site. And so those are the 2 places. I'm going to repeat it again: shatteredrealitypodcast.com and shatteredrealitypodcast.wordpress.com. Those are the only 2 places, not on Facebook, not on YouTube, not on Stitcher Radio, but those 2 places. So,
Who's going to decide the comments?
you and me.
Oh, okay. That sounds good.
And we'll let Bill have a look too.
I
What do you
think
say?
we should let Bill, because that's sort of an impartial view.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we of course thank our wonderful audio engineer Bill.
Yes.
And
And the winner again will receive?
3. Well, there's going to be 3 winners.
Okay.
They're going. It's the number 3, the magic number 3.
Oh,
3 winners will receive 3 books.
okay. Do they select it? No, we'll select it.
No, we're gonna send them the 3 books, Above and Beyond,
Each three. Oh, they will.
Difficult People, and Talking to Extraterrestrials.
Oh, everybody's going to get 3 books.
I believe so. I believe
So-
that's the case.
In total, then it'd be 9 books.
9 books are being given
Oh.
out to 3 people. So what we're looking for is the most interesting comments
Okay.
on this show with Lisette Larkins, which is number 36. And you will have 1 month
Right.
to make these comments from the time that we're recording them. So we will be announcing the winners on not our next show, but our second show.
Right.
So not the next show we record, but the one following that, because if all goes according to plan, we will be recording our next show in 2 weeks. And then the one following that 2 weeks after.
Okay.
So amongst our guests upcoming, we do have Eva Herr, Herr. I don't know if she pronounces it her or hair in the German manner. And we have Artie Six Killer Clark coming up in about a month and a half, who has written a lot about star people and the experiences of Native Americans over the course of time from Alaska down to South America and their experiences with aliens. So we're on a woman kick and a UFO kick here.
Okay. That sounds good to me.
So please make a comment at shatteredrealitypodcast.com on this particular podcast. We welcome all comments on all our podcasts, but if you want to win the books, you got to make it on the number 36 Lisette Larkins podcast.
I'd love to hear what people comment on this too.
Okay.
Okay.
Yes,
And I guess that's it then.
I think so. Is there anything else? We're free and independent broadcasting, not the mainstream media, non-commercial, free and independent here.
That's right. No political talk here. Unless it's from the interlife.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so I guess until next time.
Shattered reality.
Signing off.